There is one thing in aviation that separates world powers from everyone else. Not the airframe, not the avionics, the engine. Building one, a real one, reliable enough to carry 200 lives at 35,000 feet, is without exaggeration the hardest engineering problem in commercial aviation. The West spent 50 years making absolutely sure that nobody else could do it. They built walls around the technology, layered dependency on top of dependency, and turned jet engine manufacturing into the most exclusive club on the planet. China just proved that wall has a crack. And what happened next rattled Western aerospace in a way that goes far deeper than most people realize. So let's break down exactly what China pulled off, how they closed that gap so fast, and why this moment changes the entire equation of global aviation power. To understand why this matters, you need to go back to 2022. The world was reopening. Airports were filling up again. Airlines were rushing to rebuild their fleets after 2 years of bleeding cash. The demand snapped back faster than anyone predicted, faster than aircraft manufacturers could handle, faster than supply chains could respond. But the supply side was an absolute disaster. By 2024, Boeing was sitting on a backlog of over 5,595 undelivered aircraft. Read that again. Nearly 5,600 planes contracted, paid for, and waiting. Airbus had its own mountain, reporting a backlog of over 8,600 jets, with delivery slots pushed out 2 to 3 years for many carriers. More than 5,300 aircraft deliveries were missing compared to pre-pandemic production trends, and the global order backlog surpassed 17,000 aircraft combined. The math was brutal, and it was not getting better. Normal supply and demand balance in global aviation is unlikely before 2031 at the earliest. That is not a short-term disruption. That is a structural fracture that opened a window for alternatives that would never have been taken seriously in a healthy market. The engine problem made everything worse. The CFM LEAP, the engine inside virtually every new single-aisle jet on the market, was stuck in its own supply chain nightmare. Castings, alloys, coatings, the specialized materials that make a modern turbofan work don't come off a regular assembly line. In early 2026, the Airbus CEO himself flagged that engines remained the hardest components to source in 2025 and 2026. So even when airframes were ready, engines weren't showing up on schedule. Even when factories were running, the parts to finish the planes weren't arriving. Airbus delivered 766 aircraft in 2024 and was targeting just under 840 in 2025. Still below its 2019 record of 863, not because demand dried up, but because the supply chain simply could not keep pace. The system that was supposed to dominate global aviation was straining under its own weight. So the math became brutal for smaller airlines in particular. You needed planes. The wait list said 2027, maybe 2028. Your competitors were expanding, your passengers were booking, and the two companies that had dominated commercial aviation for half a century couldn't help you fast enough. That's when COMAC became a real conversation. Not because the C919 was impressive by Western benchmarks. Shorter range, heavier airframe, less fuel efficiency than an A320neo. None of that mattered in a market where the alternative was waiting 3 years for a plane that still might not show up on time. There's an old saying in business: the best product doesn't always win. The available product does. And for the first time in commercial aviation history, China had something available. That opened a door the West had spent decades keeping shut. But even that isn't what rattled the industry, because availability was just the surface. Underneath it, something far more significant was being built. So China had a plane in the market. Airlines were talking. Orders were coming in. Sounds like a win, right? Here's where it gets complicated. Because underneath that C919, literally bolted to the wing, was an engine that China did not build, did not own, and could not replace. The CFM LEAP 1C, made by CFM International, a joint venture between GE Aerospace of the United States and Safran of France. Two of the most powerful aerospace companies on the planet, both Western, both operating under Western export law. And that one fact changed everything about what China actually controlled. Most people think an engine is just thrust. You bolt it on, it burns fuel, the plane flies. Done. That is not how this works, not even close. When you buy a CFM engine, you're not buying a piece of hardware. You're buying into an entire system, and that system never really leaves their hands. Think about what that means in practice. Spare parts. CFM controls the entire supply chain. Every blade, every seal, every sensor sourced and certified by them. Software. Modern jet engines run on sophisticated control software, and updates, patches, and performance tuning are all managed by the manufacturer. Maintenance. You cannot just open the cowling and figure it out. Certified technicians, approved facilities, proprietary tools, all of it flows back to them. Certification: if you want to fly that engine on international routes, ESA and FAA cooperation isn't optional. It's required. Every single one of those touch points is a leash. And Beijing knew it. Every engineer on the C919 program knew it. Every airline executive who signed an order for a C919 knew it too. The plane existed. The airline operated it. And the power behind it still lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Paris, France. Here's what made this genuinely alarming for Beijing. Not just inconvenient, but alarming. The geopolitical environment was shifting fast. The US had already used export controls as a weapon against Huawei, against SMIC, against entire sectors of Chinese technology. The precedent was set. Washington had shown it was willing to cut off access to critical technology when political pressure was high enough. And the aviation sector had its own preview of that playbook even before 2025. In 2020, a decades-long project to develop a regional propeller plane, the Xi'an MA700, was left in limbo after COMAC. Refused to issue an export license to engine supplier Pratt & Whitney amid deteriorating bilateral ties. That wasn't COMAC. That wasn't a flagship program. But it was a warning. China watched an entire aircraft program stall because of one engine supplier's country of registration. They filed that lesson carefully. And then it actually happened to aviation at the highest level. In May 2025, the Trump administration suspended licenses for U.S. companies to sell turbofan engines to COMAC as part of a tit-for-tat trade war. The move came in response to China restricting exports of critical minerals to the U.S. And suddenly, what everyone had called a theoretical risk was sitting right there on the front page. The U.S. Commerce Department confirmed it was reviewing exports of strategic significance to China, and in some cases had suspended existing export licenses or imposed additional requirements while the review was pending. The suspension didn't just affect engines. It extended to components from Honeywell Aerospace and Collins Aerospace, avionics, cabin systems, flight control technology. The entire technology ecosystem that the C919 depended on was suddenly in question. With the LEAP-1C as the exclusive power plant for the C919, newly built aircraft were potentially sitting on the ground without engines. COMAC had pledged to deliver up to 75 planes in 2025, then cut that target to 25, and ultimately ended the year delivering only 13 C919 jets. The leash wasn't theoretical anymore. It had been pulled, and everyone in global aviation felt it. The vulnerability was exposed for the entire world to see. So even with a Chinese aircraft in the sky, even with airlines signing orders, even with the Western press starting to pay attention, the power behind that plane still wasn't China's. The engine ran, but the leash was still there. And for decades, this is the part that matters. That is exactly how the system was designed to work. Western Aerospace didn't just build great engines, they built a system of dependency so deep, so layered, so embedded in global aviation infrastructure that breaking free wasn't just an engineering challenge. It was supposed to be impossible. And for a long time it was. But while the C919 was flying on CFM engines, while that leash was still attached, China was quietly working on something that made Western aerospace engineers genuinely uncomfortable. The CJ1000A, China's own high-bypass turbofan, built by the Aero Engine Corporation of China, known as AECC, and designed for one purpose: to cut the leash completely. Assembly of the first CJ1000AX prototype was completed in December 2017. Ground testing began in Shanghai in May 2018, where the first engine reached a core speed of 6,600 RPM in a test cell. Flight testing on a Y-20 military transport aircraft reportedly began in March 2023, and by March 2025, AECC was telling an aviation forum in Taikang that development was progressing better than their most optimistic expectations. An executive from a C919 supplier confirmed to the South China Morning Post that the CJ1000 would be able to power a C919 on verification flight soon, following those tests on the Y-20. Now, let's be honest about where it stands. It's not certified yet. It hasn't logged the flight hours that regulators require. Its reliability record doesn't come close to the LEAP-1C, which has hundreds of millions of hours across thousands of aircraft worldwide. Chinese certification and initial deliveries are likely to begin in 2027 or 2028, with mass production expected from around 2030. It is not ready to compete on the world stage. Not yet. But here's the thing. That's not the shock. To understand what actually rattled the West, you need to understand what building this kind of engine really means, because this isn't like building a car engine. This is, without exaggeration, one of the hardest engineering problems on the planet. Inside a modern turbofan, blades the size of your hand spin at over 10,000 RPM, in gas exceeding 1,600 degrees Celsius, hotter than molten lava. And they have to survive that not for one flight, not for 100, but for 20,000 flight hours without failing. Because failure at 35,000 feet is not an option. To do that, you need materials that don't exist in nature. Single crystal superalloys grown in a controlled environment so that the atomic structure of the blade runs in a single direction, eliminating the grain boundaries where cracks start. Thermal barrier coatings measured in microns. Cooling channels drilled by lasers into blades so thin and so precisely engineered that the tolerances involved defy ordinary manufacturing logic. The blade simultaneously carries enormous mechanical load, spins in gas that would melt ordinary steel, and stays cool through internal air channels that are themselves an engineering masterpiece. GE and Pratt & Whitney spent 50 years and billions of dollars mastering this. The LEAP entered service in 2016, but its foundation goes back to the 1970s. That was the wall, and it was supposed to hold forever. Here's what changed. The CJ1000A's turbine temperatures are now approaching levels that, a decade ago, Chinese metallurgy had no business being near. The thrust figures are closing in on ranges that Western analysts didn't expect to see from China for another 10 years. The engine is designed to deliver approximately 20 kg 200 pounds of thrust, matching what the CFM LEAP 1C delivers to Dam a day. Oh, the C919 today. Ground tests are running. Flight hours are accumulating on the Y-20 testbed. The program is moving faster than any outside projection predicted. The West spent 50 years building this capability. China is compressing that curve, imperfectly but measurably and undeniably, and that is the shock. Not that the engine exists, it's the speed. It's the trajectory. The gap that was supposed to be permanent is closing. The strategic context matters enormously here. China's domestic engine development was listed among China's goals in the 14th five-year plan from 2021 to 2025, and it features prominently in the Made in China 2025 Industrial Master Plan. AECC itself was established in 2016 with stakeholders including AVIC, the Chinese defense contractor, and COMAC itself. From day one, this was a state-level commitment, not a corporate bet. The funding didn't depend on quarterly returns. The timeline didn't depend on shareholder patience. The engineers didn't have to justify the program's existence every 18 months to a board that wanted faster results. That institutional structure is what makes long timeline programs like this viable in the first place. It's also what makes them almost impossible for Western companies to replicate in kind. A higher thrust variant, the CJ1000B, rated at 2,900 pounds of thrust, is already planned for future extended range versions of the C919. China isn't just trying to replicate what the LEAP does today, they're building a roadmap for what comes next. That's not the thinking of a program playing catch-up. That's the thinking of a program planning to dominate its own ecosystem on its own terms. Because once the CJ1000A is certified and flying commercially, China doesn't need anyone's engine anymore. No spare parts dependency, no software leverage, no export control pressure, no phone call from Washington that grounds a fleet overnight. This was never about building a better engine. Beginning, about never needing GE's engine again. That's a completely different goal. It changes how you measure success. It changes what the finish line looks like. And it changes the entire geopolitical equation of who has leverage over whom in global aviation. So how long does that actually take? 20 years? Maybe 30 before the CJ1000A is truly mature, truly trusted, truly competitive on an international stage? That sounds like a long time. But here is what most people miss. China knew that going in. Day one, when the program was approved, when engineers were assigned, when funding was committed, nobody in Beijing was expecting a shortcut. They looked at what GE took 50 years to build and said, fine, we'll start now. 20 years sounds like a weakness when you frame it through a quarterly earnings lens. In China's strategic playbook, it's a plan. It's a deliberate, well-funded, state-backed generational commitment to close a gap that the West had counted on remaining open forever. While Western aerospace companies were optimizing for quarterly earnings, running 18-month decision cycles, and answering to shareholders who wanted returns in the next fiscal year, China was operating in generational cycles. That is a structural advantage that's very difficult to compete with. You cannot out-engineer a patient adversary when your planning horizon is measured in quarters, and theirs is measured in decades. Engines don't win overnight. They win over decades. China decided decades ago that they were willing to play that game. And now those decades of quiet investment are starting to show up in ground test results, flight test data, and turbine temperature benchmarks that Western analysts are watching very carefully. China doesn't need to beat Boeing. It doesn't need to out-engineer Airbus. It doesn't need to win a global market share battle against companies that have been refining their products since the 1960s. All it needs is for the CJ1000A to be good enough for Chinese airlines, Chinese routes, and the Chinese aviation ecosystem. Because the moment that engine enters commercial service, even on domestic routes only, even with limitations, even while Western carriers won't touch it, the leverage equation flips entirely. China controls the parts. China controls the software. China controls the maintenance. China controls the export. Decisions. No sanctions conversation can start with, and by the way, we're cutting off your engines. That is not just engineering independence. That is geopolitical independence. And in the current environment, those two things are inseparable. But there's an honest question that deserves a direct answer. Even if the CJ1000A gets certified, will airlines actually trust it? This is not a trivial concern. You're asking carriers to bet passenger lives on an engine with zero long-term commercial track record. You're asking lessors and insurers to price a product with no actuarial history. The LEAP-1C has hundreds of millions of flight hours behind it. The CJ1000A, when it enters service, will have none. That trust gap won't close with a press release. It won't close with a successful certification ceremony or a ribbon cutting at a COMAC delivery center. It closes with years of quiet, unglamorous, incident-free flying. It closes with pilots who stop thinking about which engine is under their wing and just do their job. That process takes time. It takes repetition. It takes the complete absence of drama across thousands of flights and millions of flight hours. There's no shortcut through that process, and nobody serious is pretending there is. The international certification path adds another layer of complexity that cannot be glossed over. CAAC certification inside China will come first. But EASA and FAA approval is a completely different gate, and it's the one that matters for international commercial viability. Without it, the CJ1000A remains a domestic engine. That's meaningful. Independence from a geopolitical standpoint, but it's not global competition. Western carriers won't buy it. International lessors won't finance it. Passengers flying outside China will never encounter it. Getting from CAAC approval to EASA approval is a journey that requires years of demonstrated safety data, regulatory cooperation that is currently strained at best, and a track record that simply takes time to build. There is no hack for this part. No political will can compress the safety record that regulators require. The C919 itself has not yet received EASA certification, and that process for the aircraft alone has been grinding forward slowly. Adding an entirely new, unproven engine to that picture makes international certification even more complex, and yet none of that diminishes what is actually happening here. The wall that was supposed to hold forever is developing cracks. The gap that Western aerospace companies counted on remaining permanent is measurably closing. China's turbine temperatures are approaching ranges that nobody expected. Their flight test program is advancing. Their metallurgical capabilities, the thing that was supposed to be the insurmountable barrier, are no longer what they were 5 years ago. The program isn't where GE is. It isn't where Pratt & Whitney is. But it isn't where it was 10 years ago either, and the trajectory is the story. This is what the shock actually is. It was never about the CJ1000A being ready to challenge the CFM LEAP tomorrow. It was never about China entering the global engine market next year and competing for international contracts. The shock is that a timeline everyone in Western aerospace had quietly assumed would stretch into the far future is compressing in real time. The shock is that the 2025 export control crisis, which was supposed to demonstrate Western leverage, instead accelerated every argument inside China for why the CJ1000A program needed more funding, more engineers, more urgency, and faster timelines. The weapon backfired. The leash, when it got pulled, didn't stop. China's engine program, it poured fuel on it. Every engineer at AECC who watched those headlines in May 2025 understood exactly what they meant. The dependency wasn't just a strategic risk anymore, it was a demonstrated operational reality. And that kind of demonstration has a way of concentrating minds and loosening government budgets. There is a version of this story that ends with the CJ1000A serving Chinese domestic routes for decades and never becoming a serious international factor. There is another version where it becomes the foundation of an entirely parallel aviation ecosystem that operates independently of Western certification, Western parts, and Western leverage, serving China, potentially serving much of Asia, and eventually forcing the industry to confront a world where the duopoly of Western engine manufacturers is no longer the only game in town. Neither outcome is certain, but the second version, which would have seemed like fiction a decade ago, is now a real conversation in boardrooms and government offices on both sides of the Pacific. The engine is not ready, the certification is not done, the flight hours are not there, the international trust is not built. All of that is true. And also true, simultaneously uncomfortably true, is that China has a high bypass turbofan running on a Y-20 testbed performing better than anyone's most optimistic projections, inside a geopolitical environment that just proved beyond any doubt why that engine needs to exist. funded by a state that thinks in decades rather than quarters, and backed by a national industrial strategy that has been pointing at this exact goal since at least 2016. That combination is what rattled Western aerospace. Not a finished product. A real trajectory that is moving faster than anyone outside China expected. The gap that was supposed to be permanent is now closing fast. And in aviation, that changes absolutely everything.